I'm so grateful that you have chosen to share some of your New Year's weekend with us for our Shabbat observance. It means the world to be able to be together in this way. Well, Rabbi Reuben was correct. This, as so many parshiot are as well, this parsha is full of so many points that we could stop that it is literally a lifetime's worth of consideration. But we are, of course, thinking throughout this parsha of the refrain. Moses comes and says, Shlach na et ami, in some version or other, let my people go. And though we think multiple times Pharaoh is about to do just that, he even evinces times of brokenness, of vulnerability, of cracks in his extraordinary royal and even divine armor as bestowed upon him by his Egyptian birth and the hierarchy of Egyptian society. No, every time through one agent or another, Pharaoh's heart is hardened, and he disappoints not only Moses and Aaron, those octogenarians that the Parsha reminds us they are in the fullness of years and still just beginning to do the greatest work of their life. So that's a wonderful lesson upon which to think. But over and over again, he disappoints not just Moses and Aaron, but all of the people of Israel. Doesn't surprise maybe any of the leaders, and certainly not God. But most of all, I think to some extent, Pharaoh disappoints himself. He's always on the cusp of doing the right thing, and yet it is so ingrained within him to not do the right thing that it is a downward spiral to his and his society's ultimate demise. I'm just going to share a few words this morning. It's an amalgam of wisdom from some of my most favorite modern teachers, Rabbi Mark Angel, Rabbi Mel Gottlieb, Rabbi Bradley Shavit Artson, and my most beloved rabbi of this time, Rabbi Mordechai Finley. The question of Pharaoh's heart hardening, who does it and why and how, and the words that are used to describe it, have presented one of the more thorny conundra in all of the Bible. If we have free will, how is it that God can come along and harden Pharaoh's heart? And one of the questions that gets asked a lot about this parsha in particular, although many others, is why is God so unfair? Or even why is God so mean? We hear over and over again. This is a true dilemma for those who believe and those who wish to believe and those who find themselves unable to believe in a divine being that the Jewish people have called Adonai. But perhaps those questions themselves really are not the questions that the Torah wants us to ask. They really don't get us anywhere. Enable the, there you go. Good, okay. That doesn't get us very far. Wondering why God is fair, unfair, mean, even cruel, vindictive. That doesn't get us far. One of my most favorite teachings that really transformed my life by Rabbi Finley is to hold in our hearts the notion that the Bible is not journalism. The Bible is literature. And read as literature, it invites us to ask some different kinds of questions. Maybe more precise and productive questions would be, why did the authors and editors of the Bible depict God as hardening the heart of Pharaoh? What audience is this speaking to? What need is this addressing? It seems to be unfair, yes, the way that Pharaoh's heart is hardened and then he's punished for it as the later plagues particularly progress. So something else needs to be going on. The authors of the Bible seem to be stuck between two ideas: human free will and God's power. It's an ancient paradox. And I think it is okay and even entirely permissible to sit in this paradox and to notice that the biblical authors themselves name and wrestle with and never fully solve that paradox. It is a paradox of being a human being, a creation of a force that we cannot see but in whose image we are made, where we wrestle continually with whether or not we have free will or whether or not our fate is dictated by an outside force. Years ago, Rabbi Finley taught me the notion of 3 O's and a B. God cannot be both or all omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient, and benevolent. 3 O's and a B. Omnipotent, all-powerful, omniscient, all-knowing, omnipresent in everything, and also benevolent. Because if God were fully present in every decision people made, how could we have the kinds of decisions that are made in this world? And so he embraces the notion that God's power stops at the will of human beings. Otherwise, there would be little purpose to this experiment called creation. But he and I are also uncomfortable with the idea of rejecting what the Torah says in some places just because we don't agree with the theology. So the invitation is to read the narrative seriously. Our task is to get in the mind of the authors. In the sections where God is depicted as being wrathful and vengeful, hardening the heart of Pharaoh, we are supposed to ask, what's the desired effect? What capital T truths were the authors trying to communicate? Those are worthwhile questions and require close study. There are many facets of God that are portrayed in the Torah in a wonderful book I've mentioned before called God, a Biography by Jack Miles. Jack Miles identifies about 20 personae of God in the Hebrew Bible. This version in the Exodus here is sort of God as a street fighter. If you get in God's face, such as Pharaoh does, you provoke God, God will give you a very hard time. It's not a source of consistent theology, our Torah. It just isn't. Sometimes the Torah is full of light and hope and love. Other times it is very, very dark and frightening. But in this story, we are bidden to notice, and it is glaring in these pages, and particularly these verses we read today, that the Bible notes that tyrants who oppose human freedom will eventually be humbled and brought low, generally by their own hubris and stubbornness. Just when they have some cracks in the armor, the ego and the digging in of heels, the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination that is within all of us, rears its head again. It has taken thousands of years for the prophecy of tyrants being brought low to even be partially realized. And we are lurching and stumbling, sometimes a step backwards and 9/10, or a step forward and 9/10 of a step backwards, but we're getting there. Tyrants have been brought low again and again and again and again. Though they continue to threaten to rear their heads, our sacred myth reminds us that eventually they are all brought to an end. Pharaoh's heart is hardened primarily to prove a point. The God of justice will humiliate a tyrant and harden the tyrant's heart, sometimes so that God can humiliate him some more. It's not a very likable portrayal of God here, but certainly Pharaoh is even less likable. It's a sort of confusing mythical form. It's a worldview of the struggle between the God of justice on the one hand and tyrants who enslave and murder on the other. The tyrants deserve to be brought low and humiliated. They do it to themselves, but ultimately with God adding in. But today is New Year's Day, in our secular calendar. And it is a time when the story of Pharaoh can really strike us to the core. New Year's Day, whether we embrace it or not, is so often presented as a day of new beginnings, potential for change. And so here the story of Pharaoh takes on a Hasidic element. Pharaoh is described as that which lurks within us in the Hasidic mind, our inner patterns that lead us toward destructiveness. It's the shadow self, the resistance to righteousness. There are forces within us that want to enslave us to patterns of thinking, feeling, speaking, and behaving that lead us just about anywhere other than lives of goodness. Because it's New Year's Day, we might be tempted to say, I am starting anew with my list yet again of ways that I'm going to soften my heart. I'm not going to give in to the inner Pharaoh. And yet we all know that despite cracks in our own armor, so often we are unable to live up to the lofty goals that we set for ourselves. It takes so much to be able to stand up tall to the Pharaoh that lives within us. That's where we started our Torah portion today. God told Moses to go stand up tall to Pharaoh, even when Moses understandably wanted to run the other way. So on this New Year's Day, let's think a little bit. I want to give each of you just a little assignment, if you will, to think of what your New Year's resolutions are. If you don't make them on secular New Year, that's okay too. But it's so much a part of our culture to start on January 1st with a list of ways that we'd like to stand up to our inner voices of destructiveness and say, I'm going to improve. And yet maybe look at the biblical story. Even a Pharaoh, over and over and over, gives in to his baser instincts. He promises to do good. He means to do well. Or so it seems. He asks Moses and Aaron to pray for him. That's a remarkable moment. But when push comes to shove, he reverts to his old habits. What old habits do we revert to every year despite our best intentions? Maybe despite all of the difficulty of the Pharaoh and God struggle, we might just pause for a long moment on this New Year's Day and consider the struggle that goes on within us each and every day. What do we need to stand up to? What leads us down a path of destructiveness? What small improvements might we be able to make this year, this new calendar year, that might yet stem the tide of pain, of hurt, of conflict? Again, I just want to say special thank you to Cantor Andes and my rabbi in Los Angeles, Rabbi Finley, for sharing some of these teachings with us. I am guided by his teachings every day of my life. I stumble and fall all the time, but I am heartened by the stories of our Torah, by the incredible warm bath and sweet oil of our tradition that says, keep trying, keep working, keep climbing the mountain, and we may yet get there together. Shabbat Shalom, and have a beautiful new secular year.